Alright, everybody. Hello. I'm going to get started here in just a minute. Um, Today, we are going to be going over a little bit of a brief introduction on just some elements of modeling in Maya. We're not exactly going to be creating anything necessarily, but just kind of touching on a few different elements of Maya modeling. Last week, we went through the interface system a little bit through Maya. We talked about some of the menus. We talked about some of the options. We talked about the different windows in Maya. So if you don't remember any of that, there is lesson 1 still up for you to take a look at and stream. And then, of course, you can go back to lesson 2, and you can always hop between the two for refresher courses. As far as the plan, week 3 is when we're actually going to start taking and creating an asset. But this little bit of a shorter lesson today will just be about understanding some elements of modeling, faces, verts, different modeling key tools that I use that are my most primarily used ones. And then from there, we'll talk about what's going to go down in week 3 when we actually start creating an asset. As always, I am joined by people in Discord chat. You can't see them, but they are there. They will hopefully have some questions as they start popping up. So if I start addressing random people in this video and answering questions, that's where they are coming from. So I'm actually going to chat with my Discord people for a second here, and then we'll get started. Alright, so this is Maya. If you hopefully all can see my Maya. If not, let me know. But I'm pretty sure it's... Oh, stream just went down. Okay. Okay, it's fine. Alright, cool. Alright, so you see Maya. Maya is here. Again, as a pre-warning to some of you out there, that my Maya, it might look a little bit different from your Maya. I have some different interface stuff in here. That's just from me customizing it. Don't worry, we'll actually go over that a little bit in this lesson as well. This here, up here, as you remember, is called your shelf. So my shelf has a few different buttons around on it, and I'll actually walk you guys through how to add stuff to that shelf. This right side of it are tools that I use very frequently, and we're going to go over a bunch of them in the course of modeling. So we're going to start in perspective mode. The wonderful 3D viewing plane that is not an orthoscopic view. Forget holding down Alt and using your left, middle, and right buttons are how you rotate around in here. So we're going to go ahead and start with just some simple objects. So up here in your shelf editor, this bar at the top, you have your simple polygon pieces to pull from. These are just standard objects that you can start modeling from. So we're actually going to start with something simple, and we're just going to grab a plane here, and we're going to drag that plane out onto our 3D viewport. Now you'll notice standard Maya wise, all you're going to see is the wireframe. Otherwise you've just got this endless abyss. So we're going to go up here to our toolbar, and we're just going to turn on shading, and that pops up. And we talked a little bit about this bar up here in our first lesson, so I won't keep reminding on the subject, but up here is where shading is, and I'm going to turn on wireframe to hidden line removal on top of the shaded view. So when we don't have our object selected, it'll actually still show us our edges. A little harder to see here now with them just being on the edge, but of course when you have it selected they highlight green. So we've got this plane, pretty simple, easy going object. A lot of modeling that you'll do for creating objects from reference points, you'll actually create from a plane. It's a good way to start modeling. Gives you a pretty good amount of control, and you'll see that in the future when we actually start using reference planes to model off of. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the settings of a plane. So over here in your attribute editor on the right, you'll see one of the nodes called Polyplane 1, which opens up your attributes for creating a plane. Now that it's created, this is where the node is. So currently this is what our width and height is set to, is 30.694. So it's almost a square, but not precisely. If you wanted to actually create a perfectly square sized one, you can hold down shift while dragging an object, and this will actually create a completely uniform version of itself. In this case, a completely square version of a plane. So now you'll see it's both of them are 40.307, or you can just go in here and copy and paste. Pretty relatively easy. So the next thing we're talking about is subdivisions. So what are subdivisions? Subdivisions are the different edges that you're going to have on these objects, and edges create polygons. So the more edges you have, the more you're able to actually manipulate an object. In this case, for a plane, you can only really have divisions going across certain ways, because the plane is flat, it's not 3D. So we only have width and height in this case. So as I drag this slider up, you'll notice that we're starting to create some edges. So on our width, we drag that up to 5, and now you'll notice that there is 4 divisions going across your plane, which actually creates 5 polygons. So I'm actually going to turn off my grid so you're not visibly seeing it. You can turn it off up here in your toolbar. That way you can actually just see the lines a little better. So this is your plane now. You've increased its subdivisions. Now, obviously, as you begin modeling more, you're going to start adding more subdivisions onto objects. The more subdivisions, the more polygons. There is a limitation to how many polygons you can have in some objects as far as a game engine is concerned. So you always want to model smarter off the bat. That way you can actually maintain your poly restrictions, but this is something we'll go over pretty extensively as we develop further. As a general rule of practice when it comes to modeling, you want to start off with as few polygons as you can and then model upward from there. Every step you take in adding more divisions, you want to make sure that you have your silhouettes right, you want to make sure you have your shape right. It's easier to control because as you get more polygons, it becomes harder to control. So right now this is pretty simple. We've got 5 different polygons because we have upgraded the width divisions. Now if we were to upgrade the height divisions as well, so let's say we go with 5 there, you'll notice now we have 25 polygons. Simple math. If you've got divisions in one axis versus and then divisions in another axis, 5 times 5 is 25. you'll see that up in your display over in the upper left corner for your object. In this case, we've got 25 faces and 50 triangles. How it's obviously it's calculating that if you have one polygon here, that means there are two triangles. Simple math. So this is a plane. It now has 25 faces, and we'll start to talk about some of the different elements that you can do to start actually manipulating this. I'm actually going to dial this back down to 3 though, at least currently. So we've got our plane. The first things we're going to talk about with a plane is talking about just face, vertexes, and edges. Now last week, I believe you guys couldn't see my radial dial when I right click. So if you right click in the window, a radial dial will pop up. This is a short key menu. It's a way to quicker access editing in Maya. I tend to use this more so over the other one, which is the physical interface version. So if you don't use the radial dial by right clicking, up here towards your top, you have this little button that's select component type. If you click that, it puts you into edit mode. Now you'll notice for me when I did that, these little pieces got highlighted, and these are called vertexes. Vertexes are one of the few ways to manipulate models, and that popped open because the first one to select in there is select point components, which are vertexes, and then of course parm points. We are not necessarily going to go over parm points, and edges, faces. So we're just going to go over 3 of these modes right now. The first of which is vertexes. So where every edge in something meets, you create a vertex. Weird things can happen with these in the future, and we'll kind of address that as it goes along, but for the sake of what we have right now, we have a very simple object and a very few amount of verts. So you'll notice there's just a few of them right now, and if I go in and go back up to 5, actually let's go back up to 6. Let's live on the edge today. You'll notice there are a lot more verts, and we can go in and select by dragging, or you can go in and just select by clicking one of them. Pressing Control will deselect, and pressing Shift will select additional ones, with keeping the previous ones as well. In Max, those key commands are a little differently, and I think they're a little differently for Blender, but same point on how to select verts. So now we have these selected. So we have our move tool currently open. The quick key command for that, if you do not have your move tool open, is W. Remember that our quick selection of these Q, W, E, R are right up there. So that's your pointer, move, rotate, and scale. So for the sake, we're just going to press W, and we're going to bring up our move command. So if you randomly have verts selected, it doesn't matter which ones you have selected, you don't need to select the ones I have selected. We can go in and we can actually move these on the different axes. Now, your axes might be a little different than mine as far as the color indications, because my current Maya orientation is set to standard Second Life, so that when I import, some weird things don't happen with the history. So if your rotator is a little, or if your move tool is a little different on axes, it's okay. We'll go over actually how to change that element probably in the next class, so we're all on the same page there. But now I've gone and I've selected different verts. I've moved them, moved these. So as you see, we're selecting verts and we're kind of adding a little bit of just randomization to this element. We're not creating anything. Don't judge my modeling skills based off of this random plane and verts, whatever. So that's pretty simple, right? Now we're just going to go in and we're going to press E, which brings up our rotate tool. And you'll see now we can rotate these verts selectively, so we have a whole group of verts, and we've just kind of rotated them around. Let's just do something funny with it. Why not? Sure. And then now I'm moving them. So that's move and rotate. And then of course you have something like scale, which is R on your button. So you'll notice you have all these verts selected. You can go in, you can scale them. Scale, move, rotate, and then let's say we just grab more of them and we scale those. Now, for every one of these things, you can do these universally, which is this little gold box in the middle. And if you select that, it does this on all axes. Now, if you were to select some of them and then do it on a singular axis by clicking the color box itself and drag that out, you'll notice that it's only scaling on this particular axis. Same with doing this on the Y, and same with doing this on the Z. So selecting individual ones will allow you to control particular axes. Same with the rotate tool. If you grab the open space, it's a free rotation. If you grab an individual axis, it's only going to rotate on that axis. There's Y and there's Z. Pretty easy. Side note, when I was doing that, I was undoing my command. The quick key command for that is Control Z. It's pretty standard, I think, across any platform is Control Z. So we've messed around with all these individual verts. I'm gonna go back to my basic plane here. So now I've restored it to its original state. I'm going to pop open. Yes, I will get to that, Sylvan. We'll go through edges. Sylvan asked any way to select an edge loop. For those familiar with selections and modeling a little bit, edge loops are an easy way to access more, and we'll get to that. So don't fret, Sylvan. This is more of just a quick basic introduction to some of the elements. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to select edges. And I guess we'll get started on that since Sylvan mentioned it. I did that by selecting it up here again. However, my preference is to right click. So if you hold down the right click button, the radio menu will pop up, and I go in and I select the top one, edge. So now we're in edge mode, which is selecting these individual lines across an object. This it's a nice way to select a little bit more pretty easily. Keep control a bit more finite than verts. Verts can get a little unwieldy. As you see, selecting the more verts you have, the more difficult that can get. Edges, we just have a little bit more control. At least that's how I feel personally. Now we have one selected, and it's the same level of control. And in this case, if you have one edge selected, you're actually moving up 2 verts. So if we were to go in and select multiple edges, we're actually selecting all of the verts that are contained around those edges. Sylvan's question was, can you select edge loops very easily? And yes. A way to select an edge loop really quickly, if you have one selected and you press up, it'll go ahead and select that entire line. That's up on the arrow keys on your keyboard. If you select left, it will select the next line over. And if you have an individual one selected and you select down, it'll select that row's edges. And then you can translate that back to the line by pressing left again, selecting those by going left and right. And then if you press down again, you'll have that different row, and then down and up, and you can select the different rows in there. It's in, I'm glad someone mentioned it. This is actually a really quick way to select large amounts of things when you have a more complex 3D object. You'll see when we pop up in a sphere, actually, it gets very helpful. Sometimes, otherwise, you can go in and you can just select a category and you can control deselect, stuff like that. If you don't particularly feel like messing around with the keys on your keyboard. So like sometimes I'll be more focalized on keeping my hand on the mouse versus having to take my hand off the mouse and then use keys on the board. That's me being profoundly lazy and just kind of getting in modeling groove. So I tend to forget about my keyboard when I'm a bit more comprehensive modeling. But one way or the other, there's different ways of doing things. It becomes a preference matter. And the last of these, of course, we're going to talk about is face. This allows you to select the face components, which are polygons. These are obviously divided by edges. Select them in the same matter. Drag select, shift select, control to deselect. Pretty easy. Now, when we move them, you'll notice that you'll get more movement out of face selection. So for me, faces, when it comes to like extruding, when it comes to like mass movement, I tend to stick to faces a little bit more. So when I'm doing more architectural stuff, I tend to do faces, but that's because I feel like it always retains shape a little better. That's a preferential thing. Everyone's different. So we're just gonna really quickly show you the how to move faces. It's the same thing with verts, same thing with edges. Just I feel like it's always a bit more rapidly able to create objects. So those are our three different components as far as editing is concerned, at least from what we're going to talk about for the bulk of modeling and stuff. I tend to not use parm points like at all. There is also vertex faces. Personally, I don't use this either. And then there's object mode and your multi-mode. So multi-mode is a little weirder. It allows you to do both, but I personally kind of recommend that you stay out of this mode, at least for the beginning sake of modeling. There are occasions when I use multi-mode, but if I'm trying to control verts, I would rather only control verts. If I'm trying to control edges, I would rather only control edges. So I tend to stay away from this mode, but it's there. So really quickly, we're going to drag out the next of our objects, which is we're just going to drag out a cube. And I did that by selecting the cube up here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these polygon planes over here. We're just going to focus on this cube. Obviously now we're in our 3D space. If you press spacebar and go out of your 3D space and you press F in each of these windows, it focuses up on this object. You'll notice it's a square in every one of them. It's because we drew an equal square out. Turn on shaded for each one of these. So this is our cube. This is our first actual 3D object. The plane is a 2D object. we're going to stay in this perspective view, not orthographic view. So same principle here. We're going to go into our attribute editor. Here's our sliders for adding divisions, but you'll notice now there are 3 of them: width, height, and depth. Z, X, Y in this case. So I'm going to move each of these up to let's say 4. So that adds 3 edge loops around each parameter. 3 creates 4. So we've got this Rubik's Cube looking thing right now. Pretty simple and straightforward. So you've got 96 faces and 192 triangles. And we're just going to quickly go through selection in here. So faces, and this will just showing you your 3D aspect now. So if you select faces by dragging now, when you have a 3D object, it will select all of the faces through the object, versus if you were just click selecting, you are only selecting that face. Edges, so if we select an edge and we press up, we get the whole row. If we press left, we get the edge loop itself. This was what I was saying earlier, is a little bit easier to control. So if we go ahead and select that, or if we double click, this allows you to select it. So if we press shift, we double click it, select all your different edge loops. So now we're controlling these, and I'm scaling that on just like one particular axis. Side note, if you press control while selecting an individual axis, it will cancel out that axis and use the other 2. So you'll see in this case it's scaling it on 2 different axes, but it's locking the one that I have control selected. So this is our wonderful little cube. Now this is we'll bring out a cylinder, and you'll notice when you create a cylinder, it does 2 things. The first of which is creating its base structure, and when you go to drag it out and you hold it down, you control the size of what you're creating, the cylinder, and then its second parameter is its height. Now if you mess it up, no big. The radius and the height are both here in the attribute editor, so we can control its height, we can control its radius, make it fatter. I always try to get this parameter set close to what the object needs before I do much of anything, but it doesn't matter. You're going to scale things, you're going to move it around, so it becomes irrelevant afterwards. But whenever I'm blocking things out, I tend to try and stick towards getting the shape as close as I can through that parameter. And of course you've got your height divisions and your cap divisions, which are these little top parameters. So that's a cylinder. Next thing in here, of course, is a sphere. Pretty straightforward on the whole sphere aspect. It's a sphere. Here you control your axes and divisions. So if we're at 10, so that shows you we're at 10 across this way and 10 this way. Control your radius. That's 8. Maybe I should learn how to count. Spheres are always relatively dense objects. They're always going to have a high amount of polygons. So when I'm working architecturally speaking, I tend to avoid spheres, because obviously the silhouette of them, even with this 10 by 10, you're still pretty jaggedy. at least as far as if you're talking about a large scale object. If you're, a small object and you're this far away from it, it looks fine. Like that looks like a ball. Then of course if you're this close to it, you're like, okay, well now I can start to see this. So every little bit counts too when you're talking out a sphere. So if I'm just jumping up to a 12 by 12, we're at almost 150 faces. If we're jumping up to like a 15 by 15, we've already added a bunch of more polygons at this point. So these spheres I tend to avoid personally. We're not really going to mess around too much with this today. Same kind of principle. Select your faces, select your verts, and your edges. Pretty easy, straightforward. I'm going to get rid of these objects. And of course you've got your cone tool. First parameter that you drag out with it is the base, much like the cylinder, and the second one is its height. Pretty straightforward there. And then of course you've got your pyramid. Pretty easy. This is a single drag parameter, so it's only one tool set. Now you pretty much have this to adjust as your side length, which is the length, of course, of your individual sides. And you've got your height divisions, and you have your cap divisions. Now if you want it to be taller, obviously just controlling its vert does that pretty simple. You'll notice that because we only have one vert at the top, moving these objects is a little different. I don't use pyramids that much. I use them for like studs and like accent details because it's pretty easy to add division loops to make it a high polygon piece that you don't necessarily need to worry too much about the geo because it's a small rivet detail. That's just me personally. Next, of course, we have our torus, which is our donut. Now, when you drag out a donut torus, the first thing you get is your diameter of your object, and the second thing you get is the thickness of the torus. This is another one that you want to be mainly concerned with getting like the thickness and stuff of this correct and accurate before you do too much to the object. And these are controlled, of course, in the attribute editor. Radius controls your overall diameter of the object. So, of course, as the smaller as this gets, it seems like it's actually getting thicker. But the section radius itself is actually retaining. But if we up that and we get a fat donut, the twist parameter is something that we're not really going to get into that. It's not really a big deal. But that's a torus. And then of course you have your pipe tool, which is basically a cylinder, except you now can control the wall thickness of it. Pretty simple, straightforward. If you ever actually have a cylinder, though, like you'll see in this, and I'll actually show you how to do this later, getting it to be a pipe itself is actually really not that bad. So if you end up needing a pipe, but you had a cylinder, pretty easy to translate between the two. So I don't use pipes that much. They're helpful, but not that big of a deal. So those are different objects. Just a quick recap on that. Up here in your toolbar, you've got your sphere, you've got your cube, cylinder, cone, plane, torus, pyramid, and your pipe. Now that we have those covered, we're just going to talk a little bit about some modeling aspects here. This is actually when we're going to get a little bit into our tool settings as well. So the first thing we're going to really talk about is your object versus world versus local. When we talk about translations and rotations and scaling, those of you familiar, of course, with working like inside any type of modeling program know that you have your set world axes. Y is always Y, X is always X, Z is always Z. Now, when you talk about an object's particular orientation, it changes as the object changes. So if you have an object that's been rotated, now its orientation is technically different because the object itself and its parameters has been rotated. So now it's Z. So I'm trying to show you guys this as best as I can. If you have world selected, you'll notice that Z is up. It's a arrow pointing upward, or if, for whichever case in your parameters it might be a little different. But now when I go to object, that Z has been rotated along with the object. So now if I rotated it back, the Z is back to that parameter. If I rotated it forward, the Z is now pointing forward there. Same with if it was only partially rotated. Now in object mode, for the move settings, the Z has been oriented towards that way. So this is something that'll come in handy a lot when you start modeling. Yes, Sylvan, exactly. Just like world and local rollers in Second Life, any type of like art system for 3D always has a local and a world setting. So the other thing I was going to tell you about this is like, so if we actually have an object where we have deleted its history, which we'll get into a bit more comprehensively later. So right now this object has actually been rotated 45 degrees. If I were to delete its history, actually freeze its transformations is what I meant. Deleting its history actually gets rid of that freeze transformation after it's been happening. So now we have 0 on its parameters, which means locally speaking, it's not going to be dictated by the object, because the object, according to Maya, hasn't been rotated, it hasn't been moved. This is how the object works. We can actually go in and select faces, and we can tell it to move on a custom axis orientation. So in this case, this face is slanted at a 45-degree angle, and it's now telling itself, okay, I can move these components now based on how that face is being oriented. And that's done, of course, by selecting custom axis orientation. And it's the same with verts when it's applied. They all move on that axis. And it'll save that preference until you reassign it. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my object being flat and at 0. So those are the different orientations. Some of the other ones are a little bit different parameters, but not necessarily stuff we're going to worry about right now. Rotate is the same. You've got your world. These different settings, object versus manipulator. If you have multiple objects selected, so let's say we have a couple of objects and we have them all selected, and we go into our rotate tool, you'll notice that with manipulator selected, it's all actually revolving around the manipulator itself, which is your little indicator for your axes. If you were to talk about rotating them based on objects, you'll notice now it is rotating each of these individually based on the object itself. This revolves around the object's center pivot, of course. Gimbal is a little different. This revolves around the actual particular object's current orientation. Gimbal locking can occur when you're talking about rotating in gimbals. So I tend to avoid gimbal unless absolutely I need to. This is something we'll actually get a little bit into when we start having a bit more comprehensive with the model itself. And then of course local is going to change based on the object's actual orientation. Same with moving. And then of course you have your scale. So in here in your scale tool settings, same, you have object world, and you have your scale from the object versus the object's manipulator. So if we have it from the object, we're scaling it from the center pivot of the object. If you have it from manipulator itself, you're actually scaling from the kind of mock center pivot of what you have selected. So in this case, we have these corner pieces selected, and it's kind of creating a central point for all of those. So if I were to select the ones over here, it's creating a different central pivot. And then obviously, like I said, you can control the individual axes that you're scaling and rotating and translating when it comes to an object. Side note, for you guys in Discord, tag my name if you particular need anything or anything pops up. That way it just notifies me, because sometimes it doesn't notify me if there's anything in particular that you need to call attention to. So that's our basic tool settings right now. The other thing I'll call attention to is my discrete rotate system that I use pretty much 90% of the time. I have discrete rotate set on, and my step size is 15 degrees. So if I'm actually rotating on a particular axis, it's snapping every 15 degrees. If you have this off, it's a free rotation. This keeps things a little tighter for me personally, but that's because I tend to be a bit more architectural when I model, and it's kind of one of those things that helps a little bit. So we're going to go into some basic modeling tools right now. The first of which is the most common, and that's the extrude function. So if you go into your edit mesh, you'll notice that it's here. It's the top one is your extrude. When you click on things in the menu, if you just click on the title itself, it's going to default extruded already. If you clicked on this little box, it's going to open up an extrude option. We're not going to get into the options themselves right now. We're just going to get into the key function. So I'm just going to go ahead and press extrude. You'll notice it brings up its own little indicator at this point. It's got translate, it's got the scale boxes, and it's got the rotate ring around it. So if you click the rotate ring, it brings up the rotation device. Scaling, obviously, scales it on a particular axis. So in this case, you'll notice that I've scaled it inward, then created a separate face inside of this face. Now at this point we've got 5 different polygons in this one polygon. You can see how these will build up pretty rapidly. So next I'm going to show you is up on my shelf editor. That's actually the first thing I have on my shelf editor besides these 2 buttons, which are irrelevant to you guys. So I'm going to select a bunch of faces, show you guys that I clicked my extrude button up here on my shelf, and I'm scaling these, and you'll notice that they actually are all scaling individually. That's because they are faces that are apart from each other. Same with if I were to move them, they are actually individually moving by themselves. However, if I have faces in here and I do that as well, I actually just press G, which repeats my last key command. You'll notice that these faces actually are selected together, so they're going to move together. Now, if I were to go back up here and select the faces that I had not extruded, oops, not that one, and I go in and I scale these, they're back to individual movement systems. Now if you get out of this tool and you just press for your scaling, now they're all individually moving, or moving as not individually moving. So now I'm going to go in and I'm actually just going to select these guys out real quick, shift selecting them pretty quickly, and now I'm just going to extrude them all, and I'm going to extrude them upward. So that's the extrude tool. If you wanted to add even more divisions, press G again, and you'll notice all of them are moving as I'm scaling inward one of them. Move that up just a little bit. So now we have an object that has extruded faces. Pretty straightforward. Got like a waffle cone thing going on. I don't know what I'm doing. Don't ever assume I know what I'm doing. That's the first thing we're going to talk about, is extruding. There are some different comprehensive things that we're going to tackle over the course of modeling for extruding, especially extruding along a curve, which allows you to control some different aspects there. Extruding, for architecturally speaking, for me, for working, is the tool that I primarily use. It's definitely the most helpful. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is our interactive split tool. So if you go in and you select interactive split tool, you'll notice that our tool settings change to our split polygon tool. First thing I'm going to call attention to is magnet tolerance. Now, magnet tolerance changes based on the scale of which you're working at. So if I were to just up this to 6 right now, you'll notice that it immediately snaps to any one of my points. It's snapping to a midpoint, snapping to a vert point. And what this tool does is allow you to actually cut faces. So if you were to click on that vert point and you were to click on this next vert point, you click on this next vert point, click on that vert point, you'll notice that it's drawing essentially a line across everything. I actually ended up accidentally selecting this point back here, so you'll notice it cut all the way across. So if you were to actually do that like this, you'll notice that it creates a line just like this. Now, for the sake of beginning modeling, don't do this. Don't just create a point like this that ends, because now we have something it's an end gone. It's a polygon that is not four-sided. That's bad. Don't do that, at least if you don't have to. We always try to keep things in polygon perspective, so everything is a four-sided object or triangles. If we're high polygon modeling, it's really important to keep proper edge flow. So you always want to try and, if you're creating more divisions in something in your split polygon tool, you always want to try and wrap it kind of all the way around an object, or terminating the edges somehow. So if I were to just, sometimes this tool doesn't function as properly as you want it to. Now I have only polygons and triangles in this case. So that's the split polygon tool. If we go back into it, I press G again, and we lower the magnet tolerance. Now we're free floating this, and it won't necessarily snap to anything, and we can just draw crazy erratic lines. this is terrible. Don't do that. You'll give me a heart attack. The downside to not having a snap on is that if you were to try and hit this edge and move it to this edge, you'll notice that for the most part it doesn't necessarily snap to that vert point. So if I zoom way in here, you'll notice that it's not actually on that vert point, but it looks like it is from an outside perspective. So for the sake of beginning modeling practices, keep your magnet tolerance up, snap to points like that. I'm going to get rid of all of these lines. The next thing we're going to talk about is our insert edge loop tool. Where are you? I have mine actually up here on my shelf. Split selected edge ring. I'm trying to remember where you are in the menu. God, it's been a while since I've used it. It's not my cut faces tool. Insert edge loop tool. Here we go. This is this key command right up here on my shelf. It's this little yellow line. Now, this one is another one of my tools that's probably in my top used tools. This actually just creates a edge loop all the way around. So now it's gone all the way around. Same with if I did it here. You'll notice as you hold it down, it'll actually show you where the whole ring is going. Now, if theoretically you had cut off one of these faces and turned it into a triangle, you'll notice that if I try and edge loop this, it cuts off. That's because there's not proper edge flow to it, so it's stopping at that particular point. That's why we keep good edge flow, especially when you're trying to create a high polygon model. You'll need good edge flow to create divisions around edges, so that it keeps your high polygon sharp if you're doing architecturally speaking. Now that's using just relative distance from edge. Multiple edge loops allows you to actually control how many, and this will equally split the difference between all. So in this case, if I have just one, it's doing it exactly down the middle. If I have two, it's equally splitting those two edge loops precisely down the middle of that. And then of course if we have three, boom, splits them perfectly. Four, you get the point. Now that's helpful when you have like a long object and you need to split it up precisely evenly instead of dragging out four individual lines and it kind of being slightly off kilter from each other. It'll split things up pretty nicely. Now we have, let's see, what else do we need to go over today? We won't go over too many of the tools because we're going to start modeling soon. Next week, not next week, the next lesson, which will be in 2 weeks. Now, a couple of the other things I guess we can talk about is connecting vert points. So right now I have 2 vert points selected. This is, in mine, it's this little, no, is it you? Yeah, it is you. This allows you to just connect vert points pretty quickly. In this, it is, wow. This shows you how much I don't use my menus. Connect components. There we go. I'm so used to not opening these menus that I don't remember where 90% of the things are. So if I stumble on that, don't blame me. It's because I have these buttons here as a convenient factor. So that allowed us just to easily connect these points. Same thing as that the tool we were using earlier, the interactive split tool. But it allows us to connect points more rapidly. It's just kind of a quick key command kind of thing. As a general sidebar, I know I told you guys I would. As far as your shelf is concerned, if you are wanting to add these to your shelf as well, Control-Shift-Click will add a little button to your shelf editor. If you Control-Shift-Click the name, it will add a button that does the default. If you want the comprehensive version, you can Control-Shift-Click the box, but this will always open the menu to it. I don't necessarily recommend that, but that's a personal preference kind of thing. You know, it's kind of your opinion there. So other things to talk about, of course, is vert merging. So if we have a bunch of these verts selected, and we go into merge vertices, which is that little button on my so if we have merge, of course, because these are relatively far apart, I don't know how far that's going to show. Okay, so let's see. So I went in and I actually just selected a bunch of verts, and I went in and merged them. Right now, in our attribute editor, you have your distance, which is kind of like your threshold for these. Now these are all pretty far apart. So if I were to just up it to 5, you'll notice it doesn't do anything. If I up it to 7, they are all merged into one. If I go, it's all going to collapse them. So you can do this with less points. If I were to merge these, pretty easy. Now there is another way to do that as well, which is to collapse them. This is where it is on my menu. Collapse, edit, collapse is another way to do this. I'm not really sure why that's not cooperating with me. Did I press it? Yeah, I did. That's weird. Oh, that might only work in faces in this. Yep, only works in faces. So in that case, if you have faces selected, you'll notice it just collapses all those faces individually. Pretty simple, straightforward piece there. Let's see. Okay, another thing to go over as far as basic modeling tools are concerned is extraction. So if we have these faces here selected, and we go into extract, which is here on my toolbar, and it should be in mesh, and we press extract. You'll notice now it'll go automatically default to edit mode. We're going to go back to object mode by selecting this guy up here. Now the faces of this object were taken away from the object. Easy way to break things apart, which will bring us to another tool here, which is combine, which is here in that same area. We'll go ahead and combine them. Now, if you've extracted something and then you've combined it, you'll notice that the object is still apart from the other object. In this case, if we double-click the faces to select the whole of the object, it doesn't select the other ones. That's because now these faces are actually still separated. Now, if we want to bring them back together, so if we select all of them, you press Control and right, hold down right to bring up the secondary radial dial. And this is another quick shortcut command. It might not be showing up on the stream because for some reason showing up separate windows doesn't necessarily work. But you'll notice that it'll bring up this edit function, which will allow you to convert what you have selected over to various other selections. In this case, I'm actually going to, in the radial dial, go to 2 vertices. This now has all of the vertexes selected from my original selection. Now I'm actually just going to go ahead and tell it to merge these vertices, which it doesn't look like it did anything, but now when I go to double select it, you'll notice that it selects the whole object. That's because now those faces that we broke off have actually been welded back onto the object itself by telling it to merge the vertices back together. So this, in our history, this is where this polymerge vert shows. So that's the essence of extraction and combining. You can obviously combine multiple objects together. So if I go in and mesh combine, boom, easy as pie. Now these 3 objects are together. We go ahead and change the center pivot, which is actually under modify center pivot. It'll relocate it to the center. If you press insert on your keyboard, you'll notice it brings up this weird little icon. This is actually your center pivot, and now your center pivot is live. It means you can actually control your center pivot and move it around, which is going to call attention to something I'll show you, which is up here is your snap to points function. I'm going to turn that on, and this is actually now telling it to snap to vertexes. So now I'm just kind of telling this center pivot that I want it to snap to that vertex, and once you're done, you can just press insert on your keyboard again, and it locks that center pivot back to wherever you moved it. Now you'll notice from the object standpoint, it's all moving on that center pivot. And if you want to put it back, you just go to modify center pivot. I have that on my keyboard because I use that a lot. Pretty simple. That's something that it's relatively helpful later on. So I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of these faces, but you'll notice that in the object mode it's still basing its center pivot off that, and it's back to that. The other 2 things we kind of briefly showed you guys earlier was freeze transformations in history. So when you have the object, right now it doesn't have anything. So if I were to just scale this and move this around, you'll notice now there's all this information that it has in its translate, scales, and rotates. And if I freeze transformations there, they're gone. This object is now back to 0, 0, 0 according to its history. Now if we go back into our attribute editor, we have all these information pieces in here that, for our cube. All of our extrusions, all of our splits, merges, verts, everything that we've done to this object are all here in this attribute editor. In this case, if we are done with our object and we delete its history, which is under edit, freeze transformations. Where is, okay, delete by type history is under your edit. This gets rid of all of that information. So now all of those things are unmodifiable. Versus if they were in here and we were to mess with any of them. So if we were to go back to extrude phase 2 and mess around with it, it not necessarily there. Of course, messing with history does weird shit like that, so don't. That's for the most part stuff that we actually. There's one little tool left in here. I guess I can cover really quickly. Is deleting edge vertexes. So I have an edge loop selected here, and I can go ahead and delete that. That of course is under edit mesh. Where is delete edge vertex? Or is it under mesh? Oh god. This is annoying. It's so weird. I'm trying to remember where things are. I'll have to find out exactly where that is. I don't remember at the current moment in time. But if you find it, good job. If you don't, I will remember by the next class where there it is, delete edge vertex. I don't know why it's highlighted green. I blame NewMaya for that. That just deletes an entire edge loop. You can do that with individual edges, which I don't recommend because now we have this ugly n-gon that's just sitting here. So that's generally all we're going to go over today. These are just the very simple aspects of modeling in Maya. Like I mentioned, as far as our core system goes, next week, as I try and stumble my way through teaching people things, we're going to take an object and start modeling based on reference points. We'll of course have the reference images compiled by that point for you guys to work off of along with me, and we'll be creating a full object ourselves. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. Otherwise, this is the end of today's stream. So have a wonderful day. Thank you guys for tuning along.